3 years after the success of the 1995 science fiction movie Species, a sequel would be released. Species 2. The sequel contains many of the same characters and actors as the original, including Natasha Henstridge. While the movie surely isn't as good as the original and lacks a compelling story, the sequel does have a number of bright spots that make it somewhat fun and enjoyable to watch. Now in Species 2, we once again follow an alien-human hybrid attempting to mate. If successful, it could unleash a new dominant species that would wipe out mankind. This time, the alien, though, is a man, not a woman. More specifically, an astronaut that had just returned home from Mars. He's a celebrity and determined to fornicate as much as possible. The movie has several strengths and weaknesses, in my opinion. One of the biggest weaknesses, I thought, is that Natasha Henstridge, star of the original, is underutilized. For most of the movie, she's locked up in a cage, and then Henstridge plays another alien hybrid in this movie, Eve, who was created from Syl's DNA. Syl was the original alien hybrid in the first movie, Species. Now, Eve's sole purpose for being alive is that so that we can study this species, and if it ever comes to Earth, essentially learn how to kill it. So Henstridge, or Eve, is definitely underutilized, not to mention her demeanor and character. It just feels very different from Syl's in the first one. Syl was somehow innocent and just trying to discover who she was. Eve seems more mature and tame, and for the most part has accepted that she's probably just going to die a lab rat. Now, there's a massive plot hole in this film too around the astronauts, and this has really bothered me in terms of watching it. They come back from landing on Mars, and they're basically just released out into the public without any quarantine, and this is just so completely unrealistic. Astronauts are required to quarantine for at least 21 days after being in space. Apollo 11, for example, followed this procedure, and after visiting a new planet, we can only expect that this quarantine would be much longer, because the 21 days is if you're just out in space. Now, one other inconsistency has to do with the astronauts in general upon return and their physical health. After being in space, it takes weeks, sometimes months, for astronauts to be able to walk and start doing normal activities really again. And the three come back and within days are just living life normally, which is just completely unrealistic. Now, in the movie, another big weakness was Press Lennox, played by Michael Madsen, and Dr. Laura Baker. They're back once again from the original, and the chemistry between them is completely gone from the first movie. Press, he runs some sort of private security firm, and Dr. Baker is in charge of Eve's lab. They're not on screen enough together, and it's not clear why exactly their romance ended from the first movie, but it's definitely disappointing that there's no sort of chemistry between them in this film. Now, like most sequels, the kill count, it's much higher in this movie. That's expected, but there's really not any memorable kills, and sometimes they just feel rushed. I think my biggest issue, though, with Species 2 is that I just wasn't a big fan of the story in general. It felt disconnected and also really wasn't that intriguing. There's not really any mystery, and it lacks suspense big time. One other weakness in the movie is the special effects. Also, they leave a lot to be desired, and I realize that this is the late 90s, but the first Species, that was 95, and I thought the effects were pretty good for back then. Now, the movie, as mentioned, feels disorganized at times. There's the story with Patrick Ross, and then it shifts back to Eve. They connect them because Eve is now telepathic and can sense Patrick, but it just feels like they wanted these separate stories to merge somehow, and it feels very forced to me. In general, the movie's somewhat entertaining, but it's definitely a big step down from the original.